I've already went over some common ways to remove blemishes on portrait photos, including the spot healing brush tool and the healing brush tool. Patch tool is often used for larger areas, but it can also be used for small areas too. And I just want to go over that one as well, and some instances where we could possibly use the clone stamp tool. So go ahead and open up lightningshadows.jpg. I'm going to work on a duplicated layer, so press Ctrl J on the PC or Command J on the Mac. And I'm going to zoom in. You can press Control or Command plus, or we can use the zoom tool here. It's a little bit out of focus, but not a big deal for this lecture. Go ahead and click and hold onto the spot healing brush tool and go down to patch tool. And how the patch tool works is if I click and drag an area and then I click and drag it to another area, it's pulling from that new area that we dragged to and transferring those pixels back onto the original area, as long as source is selected up here. So I'm going to move back a little bit. If a destination is selected up on the options bar, what we would want to do is click and drag a source area first, and then we're going to click and drag onto a destination area. It does the same thing, it just does it in backward steps. So by default, source is probably checked unless you've changed it. So that's the patch tool. It can be pretty effective. Sometimes you can kind of see the edge though. So sometimes when we make a selection, say like right here, we can go to select, modify, feather, and then I'll feather radius. I'll feather a lot, do like 4 pixels, and then click and drag, and then the edge is a little bit not as defined. It's a softer edge. That is the patch tool. You can also use the clone stamp tool. This is where if you wanted an area to sample from and you just literally just want to move pixels from one area to another, it doesn't add as much as a mixing effect like the spot healing brush tool and the healing brush tool, where it tries to figure out what the right combination of pixels should be. It literally just takes pixels from one area and moves them onto another area. So if I hold down Alt, just like on the healing brush tool, I have to Alt click first, right? Just set a source area and then I click and drag to a destination area. The clone stamp tool, if I Alt click first, say right here, and then I click and drag, then it's pulling them from here, putting it over here. So notice that that's problematic because the lighting's a little bit off. You can also go to Window and then Clone Source, and you can see some of the settings that we have going on here. I'm going to undo. So if I Alt click, click and drag, that doesn't look as realistic. That's why we often use the spot healing brush tool. Now the clone stamp tool, that when we're using this, or the healing brush tool, you can set multiple sources for the clone source. So if I Alt click here, and I go over here and Alt click there, notice I've got 2 different areas now that I'm sampling from. So I can select them in the clone source panel. I can have 5 here, and you can also select them there. And you can, that way you can select a couple different areas and don't have to keep sampling them. You can have a few up here, and whichever one is selected is the one that will be applied. So on the clone stamp tool, let's just say I was stamping from skin right here to right over here. So if I Alt click here, click and drag over here, then it took these pixels here and put them over here. Notice the lighting's a little bit different, so I don't want to mix that in more. Maybe adjust the opacity so it's not as strong up here at the top, or maybe even change the blending mode. So we could change it. If you want to make it a little bit darker, you could choose any of these. Make it lighter, choose any of these. You could also do overlay. So if I Alt click here and click and drag over here, it's a little bit more of a subtle effect, especially with that opacity down. If we have current layer selected, it's only sampling from this current layer that we have selected in the layers panel. If we did current and below, or all layers, if you had a bunch of layers, then it would sample from all the layers. And one more thing to be aware of, if you select, for example, the patch tool or a lot of these other tools, you can actually use a fade effect, and that's another way of making the effect a little bit more subtle. Instead of doing an opacity on a new layer or as part of the tool, up here there's no opacity right now effect available, right? You can click on all these, there's no opacity. You would have to do something on a new layer. Well, you can actually, let's say, just click and drag around here, click and drag it over. All right, and then immediately go up to Edit and then Fade Patch Selection. And you can adjust the opacity, and you'll see the freckle just kind of comes back a little bit. Uncheck Preview. You can see the before and after. So it makes the effect a little bit more subtle, where it shows through a little bit. Again, that is after you apply the change, just go to Edit, and then it'll be right here, the Fade. All right, so we can fade, let's say, Clone Stamp tool. Alt-click, then click and drag over here. Then I go to Edit, Fade Clone Stamp, and it's going to fade that clone stamp, make it a little bit more subtle. You can also change the blending mode on this one too to do different things. Darker would make it a little bit darker, obviously, or multiply, or screen would make it lighter. Wouldn't want to do that unless we're just trying to lighten the skin. So a lot more options to make that retouching and removing the blemishes or freckles or moles just a little bit more subtle. And so it's not as, it doesn't look fake, so it doesn't look photoshopped or faked, more of a realistic look. So that is the clone stamp tool as well as the patch tool, and a couple more options as far as using multiple clone sources and fading the effect after we've applied it.